My name is Maris Wren, and this is the story of how I began again. I was born somewhere in America, though for most of my life, I didn't have a place to call home. After my parents divorced, I was left on the street like a forgotten coat someone dropped and never came back for. I was 13, old enough to remember the sound of their voices fighting, and young enough to still believe that maybe one of them would come back for me. They never did. The city moved on, and I became one of the small ghosts walking its edges. The first winter, I slept under an overpass near Savannah, Georgia. It was loud and smelled of rust and rain. Every night, trucks groaned overhead like tired animals. I wrapped myself in a blanket I found behind a grocery store, and when it was too cold, I walked just to keep warm. Hunger was a strange thing. It didn't come all at once. It grew in quiet steps, whispering that you'd give anything for a crust of bread, a single bite of something warm. Sometimes I'd find half-eaten sandwiches in bins behind cafes. I learned not to be proud. Pride doesn't feed you. I walked north in the spring. I didn't plan to. My feet just carried me. In Duluth, I learned to watch people's faces. Some looked through me as if I were a shadow. Others turned away as though I were a shame they didn't want to see. But sometimes a few saw me. A bus driver once gave me a bottle of water and a smile. A woman in a yellow coat dropped a $5 bill on the ground and walked away before I could thank her. It was the first real act of kindness I'd felt in months. I cried quietly in the bus station bathroom, clutching the bill like it was gold. The years blurred together after that. I moved from one city to another, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions. Providence, Rhode Island, was where I finally began to feel invisible. The city had old bones, brick buildings, and cobblestone alleys, the kind that held secrets. I fit there in the cracks of things. I ate leftovers from cafe dumpsters, washed my hair in the river, and slept near a boarded-up church. When it rained, I'd listen to the drops on the roof and tell myself stories so I wouldn't forget my voice. One summer, a storm came tearing through the coast. I was walking down Juniper Lane, a quiet street lined with oak trees. That was when I saw it, a small blue house with peeling paint, a porch swing hanging crooked, and windows that glowed faintly like someone still cared. The mailbox said Lane, the same as the street, and that name stirred something in me I didn't understand. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe the world has a way of circling back on itself. I slept under the porch that night. The boards were warm from the day's sun, and the air smelled like lilac and old wood. I told myself I'd leave before dawn. But when the morning came, I was still there, curled up like a stray cat. I woke to the creak of the front door. A woman stood there in a faded robe, gray hair pinned up loosely. She didn't shout or call the police. She just looked at me, then at the empty mug in her hand. "You look cold," she said. Her voice was calm, not unkind. "Come here." I didn't move at first. Years on the street had taught me that kindness often came with a price. But she turned and went inside, leaving the door half open. The smell of coffee drifted out, rich and bitter. My stomach answered before I could stop it. When I finally stepped inside, she was sitting at the kitchen table, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. She pushed it toward me without a word. It was the first warm drink I'd had in years. Her name was Ruthie Cobb. She lived alone, her husband gone and her son grown, and moved away somewhere out west. Her house was old but clean, with quilts on the chairs and a shelf full of glass jars. "You can help me rake the yard," she said, as if it was already decided. "I'll pay you $28. Cash." I nodded. I would have done it for free. That afternoon, I raked leaves under the sun, feeling the sting of blisters forming on my hands. Ruthie brought me lemonade in a tall glass and watched from the porch swing. She didn't ask about my past, and I didn't offer it. At sunset, she gave me the promised $28 and a denim jacket that smelled faintly of soap. "It's too small for me," she said. "Keep it." When I started to thank her, she waved me off. "You don't owe me anything, honey. Just stay warm." Before I left, she pressed something into my palm, a smooth silver coin. "A pound," she said with a small smile. "From a trip I took to Europe a long time ago. For luck." I turned it over in my hand. It was heavy, real. I'd never held a coin from another continent before. I asked why she'd give it to me. She shrugged. Maybe you need it more than I do. I walked back to the bridge that night, the jacket tight around my shoulders, the coin clutched in my fist. It glinted faintly in the moonlight, like a promise I didn't yet understand. I hid the money and the coin in an old shoe under the bridge. That was where I kept everything that mattered to me, my small, secret world. The next morning, I went back to Ruthie's. She was sitting on the porch swing with a newspaper. She looked up and smiled. "You came back," she said. I nodded, too shy to speak. "Good," she added, folding the paper. "There's more work to do." And so it began. For the first time in years, I had a reason to wake up. Ruthie paid me in small bills, 5s and 10s, and taught me to make cornbread and patch clothes. She told me stories about her husband who'd been a carpenter and how they'd built the blue house together, board by board. She said the house used to be bright, the paint fresh, the flowers blooming. Now, she said it was tired but still standing. A bit like me, she laughed. At night, I'd lie under the porch again, listening to the wind move through the trees. I didn't tell her that I was sleeping there. I didn't want to seem ungrateful. I liked the sound of her humming through the walls, the clink of dishes as she cleaned up after dinner. It made me feel safe in a way I hadn't felt since I was a child. Sometimes I'd take out the pound coin and hold it up to the light, imagining what Europe might look like. Ruthie said she'd gone once to see the cathedrals in France and the gardens in England. I couldn't imagine ever having that kind of money, but when I looked at the coin, I believed maybe someday I could. That blue house on Juniper Lane became my world. I didn't know it then, but it was the first thread in the long, tangled story that would lead me back to my real name, my real family, and a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about who I was. But for now, I was just Maris, the girl with the denim jacket, $28 in her pocket, and a pound coin for luck, standing under the summer sky, not lost, not found, but somewhere in between. Years slipped by like pages turned by a careless wind. I drifted from one town to another, Raleigh, Toledo, Boulder, never staying long enough to be remembered. Each city had a rhythm, and I learned to move with it. The shuffle of buses, the chatter of markets, the hum of diners where the scent of grease and coffee could almost make you feel safe. I had my denim jacket, the one Ruthie gave me, and the silver pound coin that I still kept close, taped to the inside of my wallet. Those two things were my proof that kindness existed somewhere in the world. By the time I reached Hartwell, Pennsylvania, a small river city with red brick mills and smokestacks, I was 23. My hair had grown uneven, and my skin had hardened from years of wind and sun. I found work washing dishes at a diner called Cole's Kitchen, tucked behind the old train station. The owner, Damien Cole, was a quiet man in his 40s with dark eyes that looked tired even when he smiled.
He didn't ask about my past.
He just said, "You show up on time, you work hard, and you'll eat here for free. Deal?" I said yes, without hesitation. The kitchen was always hot, steam rising from the sinks, pans clattering. Orders shouted through the hatch. I liked it. The noise made it impossible to think too much. Damien paid me $10 an hour, handed me cash every Friday, and sometimes slid me a plate of eggs or leftover pie at the end of the night. "You're fast," he'd say, drying his hands. Fast as gold. I saved every dollar in an old coffee tin I kept under my bed at the boarding house. On its lid, I taped the pound coin Ruthie had given me years before. I told myself it was my star. If I kept saving, maybe it would lead me somewhere brighter. But life, as it does, had other plans. It started with the tiredness. At first, I blamed the long hours. But then came the pain, a deep, dull ache in my lower back, the kind that never quite goes away. One morning, I collapsed in the alley behind the diner, my hands slick with soap and my breath short. When I woke up, I was in the emergency room of Hartwell General Hospital. The doctor was a tall woman with steady hands and soft gray eyes. Her name was Dr. Elena Pike. She spoke gently, like every word mattered. "Maris," she said, reading my name from the form. "We ran some tests. Your kidney function is low, very low. You've likely had damage for a while." I stared at the ceiling. The word damage echoed inside my head like a bell. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means we need to monitor you closely," she said. "And we'll have to discuss treatment options." I nodded, though I barely heard her. All I could think of was how close I'd come to losing everything again, the small stability I'd built, the little rhythm of my life. 2 weeks later, Dr. Pike called me back. I sat in her office, the smell of antiseptic and coffee filling the air. "We've been reviewing our transplant registry," she said, "and something came up. There's a man here at Hartwell, very ill. You're a match. He needs a kidney and fast." I blinked. "You mean I could give him mine?" "Yes," she said. "You're young, your other kidney is functioning better than expected, and if you agree, we'd cover your recovery costs. There's also a small stipend, $600, to help while you're off work." $600. I thought about my coffee tin, the way I counted and recounted the few crumpled bills each night. 600 could pay rent for months, buy real shoes, even send me somewhere new. But that wasn't what caught me. It was the idea that I could do something that mattered. For so long, I'd been invisible. Giving someone life, being needed, that felt like a kind of salvation. I asked for time to think. For 3 nights, I walked along the river that cut through Hartwell, its water black and smooth under the streetlights. I thought about the man who needed me. I didn't know his name, his age, or his story. Maybe he had a family who loved him. Maybe he was someone's father. Maybe he was like mine, gone too soon, leaving only silence. By the 4th day, I went back to the hospital and signed the papers. Dr. Pike smiled softly. "You're doing something good, Maris. You're giving a stranger a second chance." The surgery was scheduled for a Friday. On Thursday evening, I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, holding the taped coffee tin. I opened it, counted my savings, $2.83 in worn bills, and ran my finger over the coin. It had faded, the silver now dull with years of handling, but it still felt solid, like hope you could touch. I didn't tell Damien where I was going. I just left a note in the kitchen. "Thank you for everything. I'll be back soon." The hospital room was cold and smelled faintly of bleach. I wore a thin gown and lay staring at the ceiling lights when Dr. Pike came in. Her face was pale, her brow furrowed. "Maris," she said slowly, "we've just repeated your blood work. Something unusual has happened." My heart stuttered. "Unusual how?" "Your kidney function has improved. Dramatically." She flipped through my file. "In fact, your levels are almost normal now. It's as if the damage is healing on its own." I've never seen anything like it. I blinked at her, not sure if I'd heard right. "So, no surgery?" "Not yet," she said. "We're postponing. We need to understand what's happening first." She smiled, but her eyes were distant, thoughtful. I could tell even she didn't believe what she was seeing. When she left, I sat there for a long time, my hands pressed against the thin blanket. I should have been relieved, but instead, I felt empty, like a bell that had just been struck and was still ringing. I walked out of the hospital into the crisp evening air. The world smelled of rain and car exhaust. I sat down on the curb outside and took the coin from my pocket. The tape had worn thin, and when I peeled it away, the coin gleamed faintly in the light. I traced the edges with my thumb, the same way I had when I was a child sleeping under Ruthie's porch. For the first time in years, I wondered if there was something more to it, if that small silver piece from another continent had carried more than luck. Maybe it had carried a promise. I counted my dollars twice, even though I already knew the total. Money was just paper, but it anchored me. As the cars passed and the city lights flickered against the wet pavement, I realized something had changed. I had been given a second chance, not just to live, but to find out why. I didn't know it yet, but the man who was meant to receive my kidney was no stranger. He was the reason I'd been found at all. It had been almost a week since the doctors told me that my kidney was healing on its own. The news had left me hollow in a way I couldn't explain. People said miracles were supposed to bring joy, but for me, it only brought questions. Why me? Why now? And why did I feel that something, someone, was still waiting for me beyond the walls of that hospital. One gray morning, I found myself standing again on Juniper Lane, the same quiet street where I had once found warmth under the porch of the Blue House. I hadn't been back in years. The paint had faded more, the white fence leaned slightly, and the lilac bushes had grown wild, brushing the windows like restless hands. I had come to thank Ruthie Cobb, the woman who had once saved me with her kindness, for the jacket that had followed me through every hard season of my life. As I walked toward the gate, I noticed a black car parked at the curb. Its surface was polished enough to reflect the bare branches overhead. A man stood on the porch steps, thin and pale, his coat hanging loose on him. He was speaking softly to Ruthie, who nodded, her hands folded in front of her. When the gate clicked behind me, the sound caught his attention. He turned, and his eyes, gray-green and weary, met mine. For a moment, the air itself seemed to stop moving. "Maris?" he said, his voice breaking on the name like it had been caught in his throat for years. I froze. "Yes," I answered, though it came out almost as a whisper. I didn't know this man, but something inside me stirred, a strange mixture of fear and familiarity. He took a step forward, his hand gripping the porch rail to steady himself. "I'm Victor Hale," he said. "I was on the transplant list at Hartwell General. I was told a donor came forward, but then something happened. Your condition changed. They said you were healing. I wanted to meet you, to thank you for offering to help."
I felt my knees weaken.
"That was you?" I asked. He nodded slowly, studying my face with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "When I saw your name on the registry, Maris Wren, something inside me moved."
I didn't understand it then.
But now, his voice trailed off, and he swallowed hard. "Now I do." Ruthie stepped down from the porch, her eyes flicking between us. "Victor," she said softly, "maybe you should sit." But he shook his head. He stared at me again, and I saw his eyes fill with something heavy: hope, fear, disbelief. "You look like Nora," he said finally. I blinked. "Who's Nora?" "My ex-wife," he said, his voice trembling. "We had twin daughters, born 24 years ago. One of them was stolen from the hospital the night after she was born. We searched everywhere in America. I hired investigators, called every police department, even went to Europe when someone thought they'd seen her there. But she was gone. We never found a trace." The porch seemed to tilt under my feet. "What was her name?" I asked, though I already knew before the word left his mouth. "Maris," he whispered. The world stopped. I heard my heartbeat in my ears. For years, my name had been nothing more than a sound I clung to, a name I gave myself when I had none. But now, standing in front of this man, it felt like something sacred, something that had been waiting to return home. Ruthie took my hand. Her skin was cool and dry. "Honey," she said gently, "why don't you come inside?" We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd once been given coffee all those years ago. The air was thick with the smell of dust and tea. Victor sat across from me, his hands trembling slightly as he opened a small leather folder he'd brought. Inside were photographs, faded, creased from years of being handled. "This was Nora," he said, showing me a picture of a woman with soft eyes and a gentle smile. "And these," he hesitated, his fingers brushing the photo. "These are the girls. 2 babies, identical but for the small pink bracelet around one wrist." My throat tightened. "Which one?" "The one on the right," he said, his voice breaking. "That was you." I felt the room spin. My mind tried to piece together fragments of a life I didn't remember, a crib, a lullaby, maybe the faint smell of baby powder. All of it vanished into darkness. He told me how they had searched for me for years, how Nora had fallen into despair, unable to bear the loss, how their marriage fractured under the weight of grief. "I never stopped looking," he said, his voice low. "Even after the divorce, even after my health started failing. I couldn't stop. But when I got sick, when my kidneys gave out, I thought maybe this was the universe's way of ending it. I stopped searching. I was too tired." His eyes glistened. "And then weeks ago, they told me about a donor named Maris. I didn't think much of it, just a name, I thought. But when the surgery was canceled because your kidney healed, I felt like something had shifted. I asked to meet you. And when I saw you walk through that gate, he paused, breathing hard. I knew. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I couldn't cry.
Not yet.
You think I'm your daughter? I know you are, he said simply. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a silver locket. Inside was a photo of the same babies from the folder. One side held a faint curl of brown hair. This was yours, he said, placing it in my hand. The police returned it years later when they found it in a box of unclaimed evidence. I kept it, even when they told me the case was cold. I stared at the locket, the small hinge glinting in the light. It felt heavy in my palm, heavier than the pound coin I'd carried for years. My voice shook. I don't remember any of this. That's all right, he said softly. You don't have to. You're here now. That's what matters. For the first time since childhood, I felt something I couldn't name, like a thread being tied back together after years of unraveling. Ruthie, sitting quietly by the window, wiped her eyes. You see, she said gently, the world always finds a way to bring us home.
I didn't know what to say.
I only knew that I was no longer the same girl who had wandered from city to city. Somewhere between the bridge in Savannah, the diner in Hartwell, and this porch on Juniper Lane, I had crossed the invisible line between being lost and being found. Victor reached across the table and covered my hand with his. You saved my life, he said. First by agreeing to give your kidney to a stranger, then by walking through that gate today. The tears finally came, quiet, unstoppable. I didn't know what the future held or how to make up for all the years we'd lost. But in that moment, with Ruthie's porch creaking softly outside and the blue house holding us close, I knew that the story I'd been living all my life had just begun to make sense. And for the first time, I believed that miracles could be real, not because they defied nature, but because they brought people back to where they belonged. The days after the truth came out felt unreal, like walking through someone else's dream. The hospital confirmed what Victor and I already knew in our hearts. I was his daughter, the one stolen from the hospital 24 years ago. When the doctor handed Victor the DNA results, his hands shook. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, in a broken whisper, he said, I can breathe again. He told me the rest of his story slowly, as if the words themselves hurt. He and Nora, my mother, had been young when they had twin girls in Charlottesville, Virginia. He said I was the smaller baby, born quiet, eyes wide open. On the second night, a nurse changed shifts, and when she returned, my crib was empty. 1 minute you were there, the next you were gone, he said, pressing his palm against his chest. I never forgave myself for leaving the room. They searched everywhere, newspapers, police, private detectives. But the trail went cold. Grief hollowed out their marriage. Nora stopped painting, Victor stopped sleeping. He sold his car to pay for search ads and eventually lost his job. When his kidneys failed years later, he thought life had closed its circle. I listened quietly, unable to find my voice. I told him how I'd grown up, Savannah's bridges, Duluth's alleys, the food I'd scavenged, and the old blue house on Juniper Lane where Ruthie Cobb had saved me. When I said I'd offered my kidney to a stranger who turned out to be him, he laughed softly through his tears. You saved me twice, he said. He wanted me to meet Nora. She deserves to see you, he said. So we drove to Lancaster County, through rain and open fields. Nora opened the door before we even knocked. For a moment she just stared, her hand over her mouth. Then she whispered, Maris? Her voice cracked, and I saw myself reflected in her gray eyes. We spent hours in that kitchen. She showed me a wooden box she had kept hidden for 2 decades, baby socks, the hospital bracelet, and a yellowed newspaper clipping that read, Infant missing from local maternity ward. She had never thrown it away. I told myself if I did, you'd truly be gone, she said. There were no accusations, no questions about where I had been. Only quiet wonder and grief for all the years we had lost. I learned that my sister, Clara, lived in Boston and had 2 small children. When she called that evening, her voice trembled. I always felt like part of me was missing, she said. Now I know why. Victor's health began to improve after that. The doctors couldn't explain it, but I could see the change, the color returning to his face, the light in his eyes. "Peace heals," he said simply. We rented a small white house near the park in Harrisburg, with creaky floors and a porch just big enough for 2 chairs. I used my savings, $6.12, to pay the first month's rent. Victor insisted on buying us a table and 2 mismatched chairs from a thrift store. On the refrigerator, I taped the pound coin Ruthie had given me, and next to it, Victor wrote on a scrap of paper, "Maris, you're found." Some nights, I still woke up thinking I was under the bridge in Savannah. Old habits die slowly. But then I'd hear the hum of the heater, or Victor's quiet snore in the next room, and I'd remember I wasn't lost anymore. In spring, we visited Ruthie. She was frail but smiling, sitting on her porch with a blanket over her knees. When she saw Victor, she said, "So, this is the man who belongs to her story." He kissed her hand and thanked her for saving the girl who had once been his daughter and didn't even know it. Ruthie passed away that autumn. We buried her beside the church on Juniper Lane, beneath a tree heavy with lilac blooms. I laid one of her own flowers on the grave and whispered, "You are the bridge that led me home." After that, I tried to build a life worth keeping. I found work at a small library, shelving books in the quiet hours of the morning. Nora started painting again, sunsets, rivers, and faces that looked strangely familiar. Victor joined a support group for parents who had lost children. "I don't belong there anymore," he told them, smiling. "But I stay to remind them that miracles happen." Sometimes, at night, I sit by the window and count my small blessings, $1.45 for groceries, $10 tucked away for a movie, and the rest for rent. Money is still tight, but my heart is full in ways it never was before. I keep the locket Victor gave me beside the coin on the fridge, both glinting faintly in the light. One from the past, one from a promise. Together, they remind me of who I was and who I became. When people ask about my story, I tell it in simple words, because the truth doesn't need fancy ones. I was lost once. I was hungry and forgotten. I was offered a chance to give life to a dying man, and when I met him, his eyes widened because he knew me. He was my father. He loved me before he even knew my name. He told me how I was stolen, how he searched, how he never stopped hoping. And now, here I am, Maris Wren, in a small white house in America, telling my story so I'll never forget that love can find its way back, even after 24 years of silence.